The Navajo. A journey through centuries. Welcome. Tonight, we are going to talk about the Navajo people, known to themselves as the Diné, the people. This is a story that spans centuries, crossing vast desert landscapes and mountain ranges, moving through periods of prosperity and devastating hardship, resilience, and renewal. It is a story of a people who adapted, survived, and preserved their identity against overwhelming odds. Tonight, we will walk through their history together, from their earliest days in the American Southwest to their role in shaping the modern world. The ancient paths, origins, and migration. The story of the Navajo begins not in the Southwest, where they would eventually make their home, but in the far north, in the subarctic regions of what is now Western Canada and Alaska. The Navajo are part of the Athabascan language family, sharing linguistic roots with peoples scattered across a vast geographic range, from the Dean of the Canadian North to the Apache tribes of the Southwest. This linguistic connection tells us something important. The ancestors of the Navajo undertook one of the great migrations of North American history. Exactly when this migration occurred remains a subject of scholarly debate and tribal oral tradition. Archaeological and linguistic evidence suggests that Athabascan-speaking peoples began moving southward sometime between 1400 and 1500 CE, though some evidence points to even earlier movement. This was not a sudden exodus, but rather a gradual migration that likely took place over generations. As small bands moved south through the mountain corridors of the Rockies, adapting to new environments as they traveled. The oral traditions of the Navajo themselves speak of this journey differently, but no less profoundly. According to Diné traditional teachings, the people emerged through several underworlds before arriving in the present world, the glittering world. These emergent stories are not merely myths, but encoded histories, philosophical frameworks, and guides for living. They describe the people's relationship with the holy people, the spiritual beings who taught them how to live in harmony with the world around them. By the time Spanish explorers first encountered them in the 16th century, the Navajo had established themselves in the Four Corners region, that remarkable place where Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico meet. This land, which the Navajo called Dineta, would become the spiritual and physical center of their world. It is a landscape of extraordinary beauty and harsh demands. Red rock canyons carved by ancient waters, high desert plateaus where summer heat gives way to winter snows, mountains sacred to Navajo cosmology rising above the surrounding terrain. The Navajo did not arrive in an empty land. The Southwest had been home to sophisticated civilizations for millennia. The ancestral Puebloans, whom we once called the Anasazi, had built remarkable cliff dwellings and developed advanced agricultural systems before mysteriously abandoning their great centers like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon in the late 13th century. When the Navajo arrived, they encountered the descendants of these ancient peoples, the Pueblo Indians living in their adobe villages along the Rio Grande and in scattered locations across New Mexico and Arizona. This encounter would prove transformative for both peoples. The Navajo, who had been primarily hunters and gatherers in their northern homeland, learned agriculture from the Puebloans. They learned to grow corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters that sustained so many Native American societies. They learned to weave, eventually developing this craft into an art form that would become world-renowned. They learned new spiritual practices and incorporated Pueblo ceremonial elements into their own religious traditions. But the Navajo were not simply copying their neighbors. They were synthesizing, adapting, and creating something new. They took the agricultural knowledge they learned and applied it with flexibility, never becoming as dependent on farming as the Puebloans were. They maintained their mobility, their ability to move with seasons and opportunities. They took the weaving techniques they learned and transformed them, eventually creating textiles of such distinctive beauty and quality that they became highly valued trade goods. When the Spanish introduced sheep and horses to the southwest in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the Navajo adapted once again. The sheep would become central to Navajo life, providing wool for weaving, meat for sustenance, and a measure of wealth. The wool from Navajo churro sheep, a hardy breed descended from Spanish flocks, would be woven into the blankets and rugs that would make Navajo textiles famous. The horses gave them greater range and mobility, transforming their ability to hunt, trade, and when necessary, raid and defend their territory. By the 17th century, the Navajo had developed a distinctive way of life that blended elements from different sources into something uniquely their own. They were semi-nomadic pastoralists who also practiced agriculture. They lived in hogans, traditional dwellings made of logs and earth, with doors facing east to greet the rising sun. These homes were more than mere shelter. They were cosmological statements, embodying Navajo beliefs about the proper relationship between humans and the sacred directions, between the people and the earth. The Navajo social structure was based on matrilineal clans. A person was born into their mother's clan and born for their father's clan. This clan system created a complex web of kinship relationships that governed marriage, mutual obligation, and social organization. It meant that a Navajo person was never simply an individual, but always a member of multiple interconnected groups, carrying responsibilities and receiving support from an extended network of relations. Navajo religion and philosophy emphasized harmony and balance, concepts embodied in the word Hojo, which encompasses beauty, harmony, balance, and order. The goal of life was to walk in beauty, to maintain proper relationships with the land, with other people, and with the holy people. When this balance was disrupted through illness, conflict, or transgression, it could be restored through ceremonies conducted by trained practitioners called medicine men, or hatawi. These ceremonies, which could last for days and involve elaborate sand paintings, songs, and prayers, were not merely religious rituals. They were holistic healing practices that addressed physical, mental, spiritual, and social well-being. Each ceremony had specific purposes: the blessing way for blessing and protection, the enemy way for healing from the spiritual contamination of contact with death or enemies, the night chant for healing various ailments. The knowledge required to conduct these ceremonies properly was vast and took years to master. This, then, was the society that the Navajo had created by the time they found themselves facing the expansion of European powers into their homeland. A people who had migrated across half a continent and created a new culture by synthesizing their own traditions with knowledge learned from their neighbors, a people organized by clan and kinship, living in balance with a harsh but beautiful land, raising sheep and growing crops, creating art and conducting ceremonies, defending their territory and trading with their neighbors. The Spanish colonial period, new threats and adaptations. The arrival of the Spanish in the southwest changed everything, though the change came gradually at first. In 1540, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado led an expedition through the region in search of the legendary 7 Cities of Gold. He found no cities of gold, but he did encounter the Pueblo peoples and, likely, had indirect contact with or knowledge of the Navajo. These early Spanish explorers were disappointed by what they found. No wealthy civilizations to plunder, no easy sources of gold and silver, as they had found in Mexico and Peru, just scattered villages and nomadic peoples in a difficult land. For decades after Coronado's expedition, Spanish interest in the region was limited. But in 1598, Juan de Oñate led an expedition to colonize New Mexico, establishing the first permanent Spanish settlements. The Spanish colonial project in New Mexico was different from what occurred in central Mexico. There were no great indigenous empires to conquer, no massive populations to enslave in mines. Instead, the Spanish established a system based on encomienda grants, which gave colonists the right to demand tribute and labor from nearby Pueblo villages, and on missionary efforts to convert the Indians to Christianity. For the Navajo, who maintained their distance from the Spanish settlements and missions, the initial impact was indirect. They watched as the Spanish imposed themselves on the Puebloans, demanding tribute, suppressing native religious practices, and forcing conversions to Catholicism. The Navajo continued their traditional practices of raiding and trading, taking livestock and captives from both Pueblo villages and Spanish settlements, while also trading their own goods. The Spanish response to Navajo raids was punitive expeditions and counter-raids. Spanish soldiers would attack Navajo camps, killing warriors, taking women and children as slaves, and seizing livestock. This pattern of raid and counter-raid established a dynamic that would persist for centuries. Cycles of violence punctuated by periods of uneasy peace and trade. The Spanish wanted to control the Navajo, to make them submit to Spanish authority and settle in missions where they could be converted and controlled. The Navajo wanted to maintain their independence and way of life. In 1680, the Pueblo peoples, after decades of Spanish oppression, rose in coordinated rebellion. The Pueblo Revolt, led by a man named Popey from Okai Owinga Pueblo, drove the Spanish entirely out of New Mexico. Hundreds of Spanish colonists were killed, and the survivors fled south to El Paso. For 12 years, the Puebloans were free of Spanish rule. During this period, relations between the Puebloans and the Navajo grew closer. Some Puebloans, fearing Spanish return and retribution, fled to live with the Navajo. These refugees brought with them knowledge of Spanish crops, livestock management, and additional weaving techniques. The cultural exchange that had been occurring for centuries intensified. When the Spanish returned to New Mexico in 1692 under Diego de Vargas, they reconquered the Pueblo villages, but their approach had changed. The Spanish colonial authorities, having learned from the rebellion, were somewhat more restrained in their treatment of the Puebloans. But for the Navajo, the pattern of conflict continued. Spanish military expeditions periodically attacked Navajo territory. In 1705, a large Spanish force attacked the Navajo, killing many and taking captives. In response, the Navajo launched their own raids, taking Spanish livestock and captives. This cycle of violence was interspersed with attempts at peace. Spanish authorities periodically negotiated treaties with Navajo leaders, but these agreements rarely held. Part of the problem was that Spanish authorities misunderstood Navajo political organization. The Spanish were used to dealing with centralized authorities who could speak for their entire people. But Navajo society was decentralized. Leaders had influence over their own local groups, but they could not control or speak for all Navajo. When one local group made peace, another might continue raiding. When Spanish punitive expeditions attacked, they often struck at peaceful Navajo, who had nothing to do with any raids. The slave trade added another cruel dimension to these conflicts. Spanish colonists took Navajo captives and enslaved them. The Navajo in turn took Spanish and Pueblo captives. Some of these captives were ransomed or traded back. Others were absorbed into their captors' societies. Navajo captives in Spanish households worked as servants or laborers. Spanish and Pueblo captives among the Navajo often married into the tribe and became Navajo themselves. This exchange of captives, while brutal, created unexpected connections between communities. Throughout the Spanish period, the Navajo continued to adapt and grow stronger. Their herds of sheep and horses increased. Their population expanded. They developed new areas of their territory, spreading across a wide area from the San Juan River in the north to the areas around Cañón de Chelly and beyond. Their weaving became increasingly sophisticated, producing blankets that were valued across the region. Their ceremonies and spiritual practices continued to evolve and elaborate. By the early 19th century, when Spanish power was waning, the Navajo had established themselves as a formidable presence in the southwest. They numbered in the thousands, possibly as many as 12,000 people. Their flocks numbered in the tens of thousands. They controlled a vast territory and had resisted all attempts to subjugate them. They had incorporated elements of Puebloan and Spanish culture into their own, while maintaining their distinctive identity. They had survived smallpox epidemics that decimated other native populations. They were not a conquered people subject to Spanish authority, but rather an independent nation that dealt with the Spanish as equals, or, increasingly, from a position of strength. Mexican period and growing tensions. In 1821, Mexico won its independence from Spain, and New Mexico became a Mexican territory. This change in colonial power did little to alter the fundamental dynamics of Navajo relations with their southern neighbors. If anything, conditions deteriorated. The new Mexican government in Santa Fe was weak and often ineffective. It lacked the military resources to control the Navajo or to protect Mexican settlements from raids. The pattern of raid and counter-raid intensified. Navajo warriors raided Mexican settlements and ranches, taking livestock, horses, and occasionally captives. Mexican militia and military forces launched retaliatory expeditions into Navajo territory. These expeditions, like the Spanish ones before them, often struck at peaceful Navajo groups who were not involved in raiding. The violence bred more violence. Navajo who lost family members or property to Mexican attacks naturally sought revenge through raids of their own. The Mexican government attempted to address the problem through treaties, just as the Spanish had. In 1822, 1823, and again in later years, Mexican authorities negotiated peace agreements with Navajo leaders. These agreements typically required the Navajo to cease raiding, return stolen property and captives, and sometimes to allow Mexican soldiers to pass through their territory. In return, the Mexicans promised peace and often trade privileges. But as before, these treaties were difficult to enforce and seldom lasted long. The Mexican period also saw increased American presence in the Southwest. American traders, trappers, and explorers began moving through the region in increasing numbers. The Santa Fe Trail, opened for commerce in 1821, brought American goods and American traders to New Mexico. Some of these Americans married into New Mexican families and became influential in local affairs. Others simply passed through, observing the land and its peoples, writing reports that would eventually reach Washington, D.C. For the Navajo, these American newcomers were initially just another group to contend with in an already complex political landscape. Some Navajo traded with the Americans, others raided their trade caravans. The Navajo could not have known that these Americans represented a new power that would soon dominate the entire region and pose the greatest threat the Navajo people had ever faced. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848 at the conclusion of the Mexican-American War, transferred vast territories from Mexico to the United States, including all of New Mexico. Suddenly, the Navajo found themselves in the territory of a new and much more powerful nation. The United States, fresh from its victory over Mexico and in the midst of its continental expansion, would approach the Indian problem with resources and determination that neither Spain nor Mexico could match. American conquest and escalating conflict. The United States Army arrived in New Mexico in 1846, even before the war with Mexico had officially ended. General Stephen W. Kearny led the Army of the West into Santa Fe, claiming the territory for the United States without firing a shot. The Mexican governor, knowing his position was hopeless, surrendered peacefully. Kearny quickly moved to establish American authority, organizing a territorial government and promising protection to New Mexican citizens. This promise of protection immediately brought the Americans into conflict with the Navajo. New Mexican citizens complained bitterly about Navajo raids, demanding that the new American authorities do something to stop them. The Americans, confident in their military superiority and accustomed to dealing with Indian tribes from an imperial perspective, assumed they could quickly bring the Navajo under control. In 1846, Colonel Alexander Doniphan led an expedition into Navajo territory, with orders to make peace. At Bear Springs, he met with several Navajo leaders and negotiated a treaty. The Navajo agreed to cease raiding and to recognize American sovereignty over their land. In return, the Americans promised peace. Doniphan returned to Santa Fe, apparently believing the matter was settled. But the matter was far from settled. The treaty signed at Bear Springs, like so many treaties before it, failed to account for the decentralized nature of Navajo society. The leaders who signed had no authority over all Navajo. Moreover, the Navajo who had signed had little reason to trust that the Americans would keep their promises or that American control would prove any different from Spanish or Mexican control. Raids continued. Over the next 15 years, the pattern repeated itself again and again. The Americans would negotiate a treaty with Navajo leaders. The treaty would be signed with ceremony and promises. Then raids would continue, either because the signatories had no authority over other groups, or because Mexican or American actions provoked retaliation, or because peaceful Navajo were attacked by mistake and sought revenge. The Americans would respond with military expeditions into Navajo territory. These expeditions would burn hogans, destroy crops, seize or kill livestock, and sometimes kill Navajo people. Then there would be another treaty, more promises, and the cycle would begin again. Between 1846 and 1861, at least 9 different treaties were signed between American authorities and Navajo representatives. None of them held. The fundamental problems remained unresolved. The Americans demanded that the Navajo stop raiding entirely, return all captives and stolen property, and submit to American authority. The Navajo demanded that the Americans and New Mexicans stop their slave raids into Navajo territory, return Navajo captives, and respect Navajo land and autonomy. Neither side was willing or able to meet the other's demands. The situation was complicated by the fact that many New Mexican citizens profited from the conflict. A trade in Navajo captives had existed for decades, but it intensified under American rule. Mexican and New Mexican slavers would organize raids into Navajo territory, specifically to capture women and children to sell as slaves. These raids were technically illegal under American law, but the government in Santa Fe did little to stop them. The slave trade created a perverse incentive for continued conflict. Some New Mexicans grew wealthy from selling Navajo captives, and they had no interest in genuine peace. The Navajo, for their part, were fighting for their survival and their way of life. From their perspective, they were defending their land and their people from invaders and slavers. When they raided New Mexican settlements, they were often seeking to recover stolen livestock or to take retribution for Navajo killed or captured. When they resisted American demands to change their way of life, they were asserting their right to live as their ancestors had lived in the land the holy people had given them. By 1860, the situation had become untenable from the American perspective. The Navajo had not been conquered or controlled. The New Mexican settlements continued to suffer raids. American military expeditions had failed to solve the problem. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 initially drew American military attention away from the Southwest, as troops were withdrawn to fight in the East. But this would prove only a temporary respite. When the Union turned its attention back to the West, it would do so with new leadership and a new strategy, one that would bring catastrophe to the Navajo people. The ones, Kit Carson and the Campaign of Destruction. In 1862, Brigadier General James Henry Carleton arrived in New Mexico as the new commander of Union forces in the territory. Carleton was a career Army officer who had served in various Indian wars. He came to New Mexico with clear ideas about how to deal with the tribes. His solution was concentration, removing the Indians entirely from their homelands and placing them on reservations where they could be controlled, civilized, and eventually assimilated into American society. Carleton's plan focused on two tribes, the Mescalero Apache and the Navajo. For both, he proposed the same solution: removal to a reservation he was establishing at Bosque Redondo, a site on the Pecos River in eastern New Mexico. There, under military supervision, the Indians would learn to farm in the American manner, abandon their savage ways, and become productive members of American society. To Carleton, this plan was not merely military strategy, but humanitarian policy. He genuinely believed he was saving the Indians from eventual extermination by forcing them to adopt American ways of life. To carry out this plan, Carleton turned to Kit Carson, one of the most famous frontiersmen in American history. Carson, born in Kentucky and raised on the Missouri frontier, had come west as a teenager and became a trapper, scout, and guide. He had guided John C. Fremont's expeditions into the West and fought in the Mexican-American War. He had married into a New Mexican family and made New Mexico his home. He spoke Spanish and had learned some Navajo. He knew the Southwest and its peoples better than almost any other American. Carson had complex relationships with the native peoples of the Southwest. He had fought against various tribes and had also lived and traded among them. He had Navajo friends and had even fathered a daughter with an Arapaho woman. When Carleton ordered him to conduct a campaign against the Navajo, Carson reportedly expressed reluctance. But he was a soldier, and he followed orders. In the summer of 1863, Carson began his campaign with a simple but devastating strategy. He would not chase after Navajo warriors in their mountain and canyon strongholds. Earlier, American commanders had tried that approach without success. Instead, Carson would destroy the Navajo economy and ability to survive in their homeland. His troops would burn hogans, destroy crops, cut down peach orchards, seize or slaughter livestock, and make it impossible for the Navajo to feed themselves or find shelter. It was a scorched earth campaign, methodical and thorough. Carson's soldiers marched through Navajo territory in multiple columns, burning and destroying everything they found. The timing was calculated for maximum impact. The campaign intensified in the late summer and fall, after crops had been planted but before they could be harvested, ensuring that the Navajo would face winter without stores of food. The campaign culminated in January 1864 with an expedition to Canyon de Chelly, one of the most important and beautiful places in Navajo territory. Canyon de Chelly had served as a Navajo refuge for generations. Its steep red sandstone walls soared hundreds of feet high. Its bottom sheltered peach orchards, cornfields, and hogans. Ancient cliff dwellings built by the ancestral Puebloans dotted the canyon walls. For the Navajo, It was both a practical refuge and a spiritual place, woven into their stories and songs. Carson led his troops into the canyon in the dead of winter. The Navajo who remained there, mostly women, children, and elderly people, fled higher into the canyon or scrambled up to hideouts in the cliffs. Carson's soldiers marched through the canyon for several days, burning hogans, destroying food stores, and cutting down the precious peach trees. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. Some Navajo were killed in skirmishes. Others froze to death in their hiding places in the snow. The destruction of Canyon de Chelly broke something in the Navajo resistance. The canyon had seemed impregnable, a place of safety. If the Americans could reach them there, they could reach them anywhere. As winter deepened and starvation loomed, Navajo began to surrender. First in small groups, then in larger bands. They came into Fort Canby and Fort Defiance, giving themselves up to the American soldiers. The Americans told the surrendering Navajo that they would be taken care of, that they would be given food and protection. What the Americans did not emphasize was where the Navajo would be taken. Carleton's plan called for the removal of all Navajo to Bosque Redondo, more than 300 miles to the east, across deserts and mountains, far from their homeland. The Long Walk and Bosque Redondo. Between 1864 and 1866, approximately 8,000 to 9,000 Navajo were forced to walk to Bosque Redondo. They made this journey in multiple groups, walking across New Mexico in what would become known as the Long Walk, a term that barely captures the suffering of that forced march. The conditions were brutal. The Navajo walked through winter cold and summer heat. Many were already weakened by hunger from the months of hiding and starvation that preceded their surrender. Soldiers harried them along, allowing little rest. Those who could not keep up, the elderly, the sick, pregnant women, small children, were sometimes shot or left behind to die. Men were separated from women. Families were broken apart in the chaos and confusion. Food was scarce on the march. The army had made inadequate provisions for feeding thousands of people on a journey of hundreds of miles. The Navajo were given insufficient rations of flour and coffee, food that many were not accustomed to preparing or eating. Water was scarce in some stretches. Disease spread through the columns of marchers. Dysentery, smallpox, and other illnesses took many lives. Women and girls faced particular horrors. There are accounts of Navajo women being raped by soldiers or by New Mexican citizens who came to watch the columns pass. Some women were kidnapped from the march and sold into slavery. Pregnant women gave birth along the trail, and many of these newborns died. The trauma was compounded by the Navajo religious prohibition against looking upon or touching the dead. Yet death was everywhere on the Long Walk, and there was no proper way to handle the bodies or conduct the necessary ceremonies. Not all Navajo made this journey. Several thousand managed to avoid capture by hiding in remote areas. Some in the depths of Canyon de Chelly, others in the rough country around Navajo Mountain. Still others scattered in small family groups in hidden canyons and mesas. These Navajo who refused to surrender endured tremendous hardship, living in hiding, afraid to light fires or let smoke be seen, surviving on what they could hunt and gather. But they remained in their homeland, free. Those who completed the Long Walk arrived at Bosque Redondo, which the Navajo called Hueldi, a place of suffering. The site was an open plain along the Pecos River, treeless and exposed to wind and weather. The military post there, Fort Sumner, was intended to oversee the reservation. When the Navajo arrived, they found conditions that were worse than they could have imagined. Carleton's plan called for the Navajo to become farmers, but Bosque Redondo was poorly suited for agriculture. The soil was alkaline. The irrigation water from the Pecos River was brackish. Crops planted in this soil and watered from this river failed repeatedly. The Navajo, who had successfully farmed in their homeland for centuries, could not make the land at Bosque Redondo produce food. The army was supposed to provide rations to make up for the failure of agriculture, but the rations were inadequate. Corruption and mismanagement plagued the supply system. Contractors delivered spoiled food or short-waited shipments. The Navajo, accustomed to a diet based on mutton, corn, and wild plants, were given flour, coffee, and occasionally rancid bacon. Malnutrition was widespread. Children's bellies swelled with hunger. Adults weakened. Disease followed malnutrition. Smallpox, dysentery, and other illnesses swept through the crowded camps. The Navajo had no immunity to many diseases, and their weakened condition made them especially vulnerable. Traditional Navajo medicine men tried to conduct healing ceremonies, but they lacked the proper materials and could not carry out the ceremonies properly in this foreign place so far from the sacred mountains. The Mescalero Apache, who had been sent to Bosque Redondo before the Navajo, were traditional enemies of the Navajo. Tensions between the two groups were inevitable. In 1865, after enduring Bosque Redondo for nearly 2 years, the Mescalero Apache simply left. One night, most of the Apache slipped away from the reservation and made their way back to their homeland. The army did not pursue them effectively. The Navajo, however, remained. They were farther from their homeland and in greater numbers. It would have been difficult to move thousands of people in secret. Moreover, soldiers now guarded the reservation more carefully after the Mescalero escape. Some Navajo did manage to slip away and make the long journey home, but most remained at Bosque Redondo, suffering and dying, holding on to hope that somehow, someday, they would be allowed to return home. The human cost was staggering. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 Navajo died at Bosque Redondo, roughly a quarter of those who had been forced there. They died of disease, malnutrition, exposure, and despair. They died far from their sacred mountains, unable to conduct proper ceremonies, unable to live in the way the holy people had taught. The Bosque Redondo experiment failed by any measure. The Navajo did not become self-sufficient farmers. They did not adopt American civilization. They did not cease to be Navajo. Instead, they suffered, they endured, and they maintained their identity and their determination to return home. The Treaty of 1868 and the return home. By 1868, even American authorities could no longer ignore the failure of Bosque Redondo. The cost of maintaining the reservation was enormous. The government was spending more than $1 million a year to keep the Navajo there, and that cost was only increasing as crops failed and more supplies had to be shipped in. Reformers and religious leaders began to speak out against the conditions at Bosque Redondo, condemning the suffering of the Navajo as both inhumane and unchristian. General William Tecumseh Sherman, famous for his march through Georgia during the Civil War, was sent west as part of a peace commission to negotiate new treaties with Western tribes. In May 1868, Sherman came to Fort Sumner to meet with Navajo leaders and determine what should be done about the Bosque Redondo situation. The Navajo leaders who met with Sherman had a single, unified demand. They wanted to go home. They wanted to return to their homeland, to the land between the sacred mountains, to the place where they belonged. One of the leaders who spoke was Barboncito, a respected headman and medicine man who had tried to make peace with the Americans before the Long Walk, but had been forced to Bosque Redondo anyway. Barboncito spoke eloquently of the Navajo suffering and their longing for home. He described how the water at Bosque Redondo made them sick, how the crops would not grow, how disease was killing his people. He spoke of the sacred mountains that defined Navajo territory, Blanca Peak in the east, Mount Taylor in the south, the San Francisco Peaks in the west, and the La Plata Mountains in the north. These mountains were not just landmarks but holy places, central to Navajo spiritual beliefs and ceremonial life. The Navajo needed to be within sight of these mountains. They needed to walk on the land between them. Sherman listened. He had the power to make decisions, and he could see that keeping the Navajo at Bosque Redondo was both expensive and cruel. But he also had to consider what returning the Navajo to their homeland meant. Would they resume raiding? Could they support themselves? What guarantees could be put in place? The result of these negotiations was the Treaty of 1868, signed on June 1st of that year. The treaty allowed the Navajo to return to a portion of their homeland, a reservation of about 3.5 million acres in northwestern New Mexico and northeastern Arizona. This was only a fraction of the territory the Navajo had ranged over before the war, but it included some of their most important lands, including Cañon de Chelly and the areas near their sacred mountains. In return, the Navajo agreed to keep peace, to cease all raiding, to allow roads and railways to be built through their land, and to send their children to American schools. The government promised to provide sheep and goats to help the Navajo rebuild their herds, seeds and tools for farming, and a school and teacher for every 30 children. The treaty also provided for rations to be distributed for a period of years while the Navajo re-established themselves. The Treaty of 1868 was unusual among American treaties with Indian tribes in one important way. It allowed the Indians to return to a portion of their homeland rather than being permanently removed to some distant location. This was not due to any special American generosity, but rather to the unique circumstances. The failure of Bosque Redondo was so complete and so public that removal to yet another distant location was politically and economically untenable. For the Navajo, the treaty represented salvation. They would go home. In June 1868, the Navajo began the long walk back to their homeland. This return journey was very different from the forced march to Bosque Redondo. The Navajo were going home. They walked with purpose and hope despite their weakened condition. Elders who had survived Bosque Redondo would later describe the joy they felt as they crossed back into their homeland, as they saw familiar landmarks, as they approached the sacred mountains. The return was not easy. The Navajo were coming back to a land that had been devastated by Carson's campaign and then largely abandoned for 4 years. Their hogans had been burned, their fields lay fallow, their peach trees had been cut down. The sheep and goats the government had promised to provide were slow in coming and insufficient in number when they arrived. The Navajo faced hunger and hardship in their first years back. But they were home. They could rebuild. They could conduct their ceremonies properly again in sight of the sacred mountains. They could raise their children in the land of their ancestors, teaching them the old stories and the old ways. They could be Navajo again, not prisoners or refugees, but a people in their own place. Rebuilding and expansion. The years following the return from Bosque Redondo were years of rebuilding and reorganization. The Navajo population in 1868 was perhaps 8,000 people scattered across the new reservation. Their livestock herds had been reduced from the tens of thousands before the war to the few thousand sheep and goats the government distributed. They had to start over, almost from nothing. But the Navajo proved remarkably resilient. They rebuilt their hogans. They planted crops. Most importantly, they rebuilt their herds. The sheep and goats multiplied quickly under Navajo care. Within a decade, the Navajo herds numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Within 2 decades, they numbered in the millions. Sheep became the foundation of the Navajo economy, providing wool for weaving, meat for food, and a measure of wealth and security. As the herds grew, so did the Navajo population. Better nutrition and the return to a healthy environment led to a baby boom. The Navajo population, which had been declining during the Bosque Redondo years, began to grow steadily. More people and more livestock meant more need for grazing land. The reservation boundaries established in 1868 quickly became inadequate. The Navajo responded by expanding beyond the original reservation boundaries, moving into traditional territories that had not been included in the 1868 treaty. This expansion was unauthorized from the American perspective, but the government found it difficult to stop. The Navajo were not raiding or causing trouble. They were simply spreading out to find grazing for their growing herds. Moreover, much of the land they were moving into was land no one else wanted, high desert and semi-arid regions that white settlers had little interest in. Over time, through a series of executive orders and acts of Congress, the reservation was expanded repeatedly. Land was added in 1878, 1880, 1884, 1886, 1900, 1901, 1907, 1913, 1930, 1933, and 1934. Each edition recognized the reality that the Navajo had already expanded into these areas and formalized their presence there. By the mid-20th century, the Navajo reservation had grown to about 16 million acres, roughly the size of West Virginia, making it the largest Native American reservation in the United States. This expansion was not without complications. As the Navajo spread into new areas, they sometimes came into conflict with other tribes, particularly the Hopi, whose reservation was entirely surrounded by Navajo land. Disputes over land use and grazing rights between the Navajo and Hopi would continue into the 20th century and remain contentious to this day. The expansion also brought the Navajo into contact with American commercial interests. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, companies began to exploit the natural resources on and around the Navajo reservation. Traders established posts across the reservation, exchanging manufactured goods for Navajo wool, blankets, and other products. These traders played a complex role in Navajo life. Some were fair and respectful, others exploited the Navajo through unfair prices and credit systems that kept families perpetually in debt. During these years, the Navajo also maintained and adapted their social and political systems. The traditional clan system remained central to Navajo identity and social organization. Leadership continued to be decentralized, with local headmen leading extended family groups. But the Americans wanted a centralized tribal government they could negotiate with, so gradually new political structures emerged to meet this demand while still respecting traditional forms of leadership. The Navajo also continued their religious and ceremonial practices, though often in the face of opposition from government agents and missionaries. The American government's official policy during this period was to assimilate Indians into American culture. This meant trying to suppress native languages, religions, and customs. Missionaries established churches and schools on the reservation, seeking converts and trying to teach Navajo children to abandon their traditional ways. But the Navajo resisted cultural assimilation while selectively adopting aspects of American life that seemed useful. They sent some children to school while keeping others at home to learn traditional knowledge. They attended Christian churches while still conducting traditional ceremonies. They learned English while continuing to speak Navajo. They wore American-style clothes while maintaining Navajo jewelry and other cultural markers. They were adapting as they had always adapted, taking what seemed useful from the dominant culture while maintaining their own identity. The Navajo textile arts flourished during this period. Navajo weavers, primarily women, produced blankets and rugs of increasing sophistication and beauty. Each region of the reservation developed its own distinctive styles. Two Grey Hills, with its intricate geometric patterns in natural wool colors, ganado with its bold red backgrounds and elaborate designs, crystal with its wavy lines and earth tones. These textiles were sold to traders and eventually found their way into museums and private collections around the world. Navajo weaving became one of the most recognized and valued forms of Native American art. Silversmithing, which the Navajo had learned from Mexican craftsmen in the 19th century, also developed into a major art form. Navajo silversmiths created jewelry of distinctive beauty, silver bracelets, rings, and necklaces set with turquoise and other stones. Like the textiles, Navajo jewelry became highly valued, both by collectors and by Navajo people themselves, who wore it as a display of wealth and artistic taste. The stock reduction controversy. The 1930s brought a crisis that would profoundly affect Navajo life and create wounds that have still not entirely healed. The problem was overgrazing. By the 1930s, the Navajo had more than 1 million sheep and hundreds of thousands of goats and horses grazing on the reservation. This was far more livestock than the land could sustainably support, especially during drought years. The effects of overgrazing were becoming visible. Vegetation was stripped away, leaving soil exposed to erosion by wind and water. Arroyos, deep gullies carved by flash floods, were cutting through formerly productive land. Topsoil was washing away. The land was being degraded, and if the trend continued, the reservation might become a desert wasteland unable to support either people or livestock. Government soil conservation experts studied the problem and came to a stark conclusion. The Navajo would have to reduce their livestock herds dramatically. John Collier, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, implemented a stock reduction program designed to cut Navajo herds by as much as half. The program was presented as necessary to save the land and ultimately to save the Navajo people from environmental disaster. But to the Navajo, stock reduction was a catastrophe. Sheep were not just economic assets, they were wealth, security, and a way of life. A family's status and ability to fulfill social obligations depended on the size of their herd. Ceremonies required sheep for offerings and feasts. Wool from sheep was woven into textiles that were both practical and beautiful. Mutton was the foundation of the Navajo diet. Taking away a family's sheep was like taking away their bank account, their livelihood, and their cultural identity all at once. The way the stock reduction program was implemented made matters worse. Government agents went from camp to camp, counting livestock and demanding that families reduce their herds to assigned quotas. Many Navajo did not understand the reasoning behind the program. How could the government claim to be helping them by taking away their wealth? Some resisted, hiding animals or moving them to avoid the government agents. But ultimately, the government had the power to enforce its will. In some cases, government agents simply shot excess animals and left them to rot, a sight that was traumatic for Navajo people to witness. Good animals, healthy sheep that could have fed families or been sold or traded, were killed and wasted. The psychological and spiritual impact of this destruction was profound. The Navajo had endured the Long Walk and Bosque Redondo, had rebuilt their lives and their herds through decades of hard work, and now the government was destroying what they had rebuilt. The stock reduction program did reduce overgrazing and may have prevented even worse environmental degradation. But it also impoverished many Navajo families and created lasting distrust of the federal government. To this day, some Navajo elders speak of stock reduction with bitterness as a betrayal comparable to the Long Walk itself. The program also had unintended economic consequences. With smaller herds, many Navajo families could no longer support themselves through traditional pastoralism. They needed new sources of income. Some found work in the wage economy, working for the railroad, in mines, in lumber mills, or as seasonal agricultural laborers off the reservation. This shift toward wage work was already beginning, but stock reduction accelerated it. The 1930s also saw political reorganization under the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. This law encouraged tribes to adopt constitutional governments with elected tribal councils. The Navajo were initially skeptical. The government was trying to impose an alien form of government on them. At the same time, it was taking their sheep. But eventually, in 1938, the Navajo adopted a tribal constitution and established a tribal council as their official governing body. This council would gradually become more powerful and more important in representing Navajo interests to the outside world, though traditional forms of leadership and authority continued to matter in local communities. World War II and the Code Talkers. The outbreak of World War II brought dramatic changes to the Navajo reservation, just as it brought changes to all of American society. Despite the hardships they had endured and their complicated relationship with the American government, hundreds of Navajo men volunteered for military service. Their motives varied. Some felt a warrior tradition calling them to fight. Some saw military service as a way to see the world beyond the reservation. Some wanted to prove that Indians were loyal Americans, worthy of respect and better treatment. Some needed the income military service would provide for their families. These Navajo servicemen fought in both the Pacific and European theaters. They served in regular infantry units, facing combat like any other American soldiers. Many distinguished themselves in battle. Many died far from home, in places they had never heard of before the war. But one group of Navajo servicemen would become famous for a very particular contribution to the war effort: the Navajo Code Talkers. The idea of using Navajo speakers for secure military communications came from Philip Johnston, a white man who had grown up on the Navajo reservation as the son of missionaries and spoke Navajo fluently. Johnston approached the Marine Corps with a proposal: use Navajo as the basis for a code that could be used for tactical communications in the Pacific. The appeal of this idea was simple. The Navajo language was virtually unknown outside the Southwest. It had complex grammar, tonal qualities, and sounds that were difficult for non-native speakers to master. No written form of Navajo was widely known, and most importantly, it was extremely unlikely that the Japanese had anyone who could understand Navajo. Previous attempts to use other Native American languages for military communications had been compromised. German intelligence had sent people to study these languages and had broken some codes. But Navajo seemed immune to such efforts. The Marine Corps agreed to test Johnston's idea. In early 1942, 29 Navajo recruits were brought to Camp Pendleton in California for training. These men, who would become known as the First 29, had to do two things: learn to be Marines and create a code based on Navajo. Creating the code was challenging. Military terminology had no equivalents in Navajo. How do you say tank or fighter plane or battleship in a language that had developed in the high desert Southwest? The Code Talkers solved this problem creatively. They created new Navajo words for military terms, often using descriptive metaphors. A battleship became Lotso, whale. A fighter plane became Dahetihi, hummingbird. A grenade became Ni Masi, potato. A tank became Che Dagahi, tortoise. For letters of the alphabet, they assigned Navajo words: Wolachi, ant for A, Shush, bear for B, Moasi, cat for C, and so on. This allowed them to spell out words that had no equivalents in their military vocabulary. The resulting code was complex and fast, faster than mechanical encryption devices of the era. After successfully demonstrating the code, the First 29 graduated from their training. The Marine Corps was impressed enough to recruit more Navajo for the program. Eventually, about 400 Navajo men served as code talkers during World War II, though not all saw combat. The code talkers were deployed across the Pacific Theater, from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima. The code talkers worked in pairs, usually with one transmitting and one receiving messages. They worked under intense pressure, often under fire, translating English orders into code, transmitting them, and then translating received messages back into English for officers. The code allowed American forces to communicate tactical information, troop movements, artillery coordinates, supply requests, with confidence that the Japanese could not understand even if they intercepted the transmission. The Japanese never broke the Navajo code. They captured Navajo code talkers and tried to get information from them. Japanese intelligence officers listened to Navajo transmissions and tried to make sense of them, but the code remained secure throughout the war. Some cryptographers who studied the transmissions reportedly concluded that the language wasn't even a real language, but some kind of gibberish or mechanical encryption. The contribution of the code talkers to the war effort was significant. Major Connor of the 5th Marine Division declared that without the Navajo code talkers, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. At Iwo Jima, 6 code talkers worked around the clock during the first 2 days of the battle, sending and receiving over 800 messages without error. Their work was fast, accurate, and secure in a situation where communications were critical to coordination and survival. But the code talkers did not receive immediate recognition for their service. The code was classified, and they were ordered not to talk about their work, even after the war ended. For decades, the code talkers remained silent about their wartime service. It wasn't until 1968 that the code was declassified. Even then, public recognition came slowly. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan designated August 14th as National Code Talkers Day. In 2000, President Bill Clinton signed legislation honoring the code talkers with congressional gold medals. The first 29 received individual medals, while the others received silver medals. Finally, after decades of silence, the code talkers were publicly honored for their service. The code talkers became a source of pride for the Navajo people. Here was irrefutable proof of the value of Navajo language and culture, the very language that government schools had tried to suppress, the very language children had been punished for speaking, had helped win a world war. The code talkers' story became a powerful argument for language preservation and cultural pride. The post-war era and growing sovereignty. The years following World War II brought rapid changes to the Navajo reservation. The war had brought many Navajo into contact with the wider world. Veterans returned home with new skills, new perspectives, and new expectations. They had served their country and expected better treatment in return. They had seen how people lived in other places and wanted similar opportunities for themselves and their families. The 1950s and 1960s saw increased development on the reservation. Roads were improved, schools were built. The discovery and exploitation of natural resources, oil, natural gas, coal, and uranium, brought royalty payments to the tribal government, providing income that could be used for services and development. The Navajo Tribal Council became increasingly sophisticated in negotiating these mineral leases and in managing tribal affairs. But development also brought new problems. The coal mines, uranium mines, and power plants that operated on or near the reservation brought jobs and revenue, but they also brought environmental degradation and health problems. Navajo uranium miners who worked without adequate safety equipment or warnings about radiation exposure developed lung cancer and other radiation-related diseases at alarming rates. Coal-burning power plants polluted the air in a region that had once had some of the cleanest air in the country. The 1960s and 1970s saw a broader movement toward Indian self-determination across the United States. The federal government's policy shifted from trying to assimilate Indians into mainstream American society to supporting tribal sovereignty and self-governance. This shift created opportunities for the Navajo to take more control over their own affairs. The Navajo Tribal Council became more assertive in dealing with the federal government, with corporations, and with other tribes. The Navajo Nation, as the tribe now preferred to be called, filed lawsuits to protect their rights, negotiated better terms for mineral leases, and developed their own programs in education, healthcare, law enforcement, and social services. Education became a major focus. For decades, most Navajo children had been sent to boarding schools, often far from home, where they were forbidden to speak Navajo and were taught to be ashamed of their culture. These schools had caused tremendous trauma, separating children from their families and communities, punishing them for being Navajo. By the 1960s and 1970s, the Navajo Nation was working to establish schools on the reservation where children could be educated near home and where Navajo language and culture could be taught alongside standard academic subjects. In 1969, the Navajo Nation founded Diné College, the first tribally controlled college in the United States. Located in Siley, Arizona, Diné College offered associate and bachelor's degrees, with a curriculum that included both standard academic subjects and courses in Navajo language, history, and culture. It was a powerful statement of Navajo determination to educate their young people in a way that honored rather than suppressed their identity. The legal status of the Navajo Nation evolved during this period. Through a series of court cases and legislation, the sovereignty of tribal nations was gradually clarified and strengthened. The Navajo Nation developed its own court system, its own laws, and its own law enforcement. The Navajo Nation Council acted as a legislature, passing laws and managing tribal affairs. The position of tribal chairman, later changed to tribal president, became increasingly powerful, serving as the executive leader of the nation. This growing sovereignty was not without challenges. The boundaries of tribal authority remained contested. Could the Navajo Nation tax businesses operating on the reservation? Could it regulate hunting and fishing? Could it enforce its laws against non-Indians on reservation land? These questions led to numerous legal battles and Supreme Court cases that gradually defined the limits and powers of tribal sovereignty. The 1970s also saw increasing attention to religious freedom. Navajo traditional religion had always been practiced, but often in tension with efforts by missionaries and government officials to promote Christianity and suppress traditional practices. In 1978, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed, formally recognizing the right of Native Americans to practice their traditional religions. This legal protection helped support the continuation of Navajo ceremonies and spiritual practices. Modern challenges and cultural preservation. As the 21st century approached, the Navajo Nation faced a complex mix of challenges and opportunities. With a population approaching 200,000, it was one of the largest Native American tribes in the United States. The reservation covered 27,000 square miles, larger than 10 U.S. states. The Navajo Nation had its own government, its own laws, its own college, and growing economic resources. But serious problems remained. Unemployment on the reservation was typically much higher than the national average, often exceeding 30%. Many families lived in poverty. Housing was inadequate. Thousands of families lived in homes without electricity or running water. Healthcare services, while improved from earlier decades, were still insufficient for the population's needs. Diabetes, alcoholism, and other health problems afflicted the community at rates far higher than the general American population. Language preservation became an urgent concern. For decades, the dominant trend had been toward English. Young people growing up watching television, attending school in English, and seeking jobs in the wider economy often saw little immediate practical value in learning Navajo. The number of fluent Navajo speakers was declining, and those speakers were predominantly older people. There was a real danger that Navajo could become endangered, that children would grow up no longer speaking the language of their ancestors. The Navajo Nation responded with language preservation programs. Schools began teaching Navajo language classes. The tribe produced Navajo language materials, books, recordings, videos, radio stations broadcast in Navajo. Navajo language immersion programs were created for young children. These efforts had some success, but the challenge remained daunting. A language survives not just through formal instruction, but through daily use in the home and community, and the pressures toward English remained strong. Traditional religious knowledge faced similar challenges. The ceremonies that had sustained Navajo people for generations required years of training to learn properly. Fewer young people were choosing to become medicine men or undertaking the demanding apprenticeships required to learn the ceremonies. Some elders worried that important ceremonial knowledge would be lost when the current generation of practitioners passed away. Yet there was also renewed pride in Navajo culture. The Code Talker's story, once it became widely known, became a source of pride not just for the Navajo, but for all Native Americans. Navajo art, textiles, jewelry, pottery, and other crafts continued to be highly valued. Navajo artists worked in contemporary media as well, creating paintings, sculptures, films, and literature that drew on Navajo themes and perspectives while engaging with the contemporary world. The late 20th and early 21st centuries saw increased political sophistication and activism. The Navajo Nation negotiated better agreements for natural resource development on their land. They filed lawsuits against the federal government over mismanagement of tribal trust funds, eventually winning a substantial settlement. They worked with other tribes to protect sacred sites and to ensure that tribal voices were heard on issues affecting Native American communities. Environmental issues became increasingly important. The Navajo Nation worked to remediate the environmental damage caused by decades of uranium mining and coal mining. They fought against proposals for new development that would threaten sacred sites or further damage the environment. Some Navajo communities embraced renewable energy, installing solar panels and wind turbines, seeing this as both an economic opportunity and a way to protect the land for future generations. The question of economic development remained contentious. How could the Navajo Nation provide jobs and income for its people without selling out their values or damaging their land? Gaming, casino gambling, proved controversial. While many tribes across the United States had used gaming as a path to economic development, the Navajo Nation initially rejected this approach, with voters turning down gaming proposals in several referendums. Later, attitudes shifted somewhat, and some gaming operations were established, but on a much smaller scale than on many other reservations. The Navajo Nation also worked to strengthen its justice system and address social problems within the community. Domestic violence, substance abuse, and gang activity, problems that affected many communities but that had particular impacts on reservation life, were addressed through a combination of traditional Navajo peacemaking practices and contemporary law enforcement and social services. The peacemaking system was a particularly interesting development. Rather than relying solely on Western-style courts focused on punishment, the Navajo Nation revived and formalized traditional peacemaking processes. In these processes, trained mediators called peacemakers worked with disputing parties to restore harmony and resolve conflicts in ways consistent with Navajo values. This blending of traditional and contemporary approaches to justice reflected a broader Navajo effort to honor tradition while adapting to contemporary realities. Looking forward, the Navajo Nation today. Today, the Navajo Nation continues to navigate between tradition and modernity, between sovereignty and dependence, between preserving culture and adapting to change. The challenges are real and significant, but so is the strength and resilience that have allowed the Navajo people to survive and maintain their identity through centuries of change and upheaval. The young Navajo people of today grow up in a world very different from that of their great-grandparents. They have cell phones and internet access. They listen to hip-hop and country music as well as traditional Navajo songs. They may attend college in Phoenix or Albuquerque or even farther away. They face choices their ancestors never imagined, whether to stay on the reservation or seek opportunities in cities far from home, whether to learn traditional ways or focus on skills needed for the modern economy, how to be Navajo in the 21st century. Yet many young Navajo are finding ways to honor their heritage while living in the contemporary world. They are becoming lawyers who work to protect tribal sovereignty, doctors who return to provide healthcare on the reservation, teachers who ensure that the next generation learns the Navajo language, artists who express Navajo themes in contemporary forms, activists who fight for environmental justice and cultural preservation. The land remains central to Navajo identity. The 4 sacred mountains still mark the boundaries of the traditional homeland. The canyons and mesas, the high desert plateaus and the forested highlands, the washes and arroyos. This landscape is not just scenery, but sacred geography, woven into stories and songs, connected to ceremonies and spiritual practices. For many Navajo, being home means being within this landscape, walking on this land, seeing these familiar horizons. The clan system continues to matter. When Navajo people meet, they still introduce themselves by their maternal and paternal clans, establishing kinship relationships and social obligations. The extended family remains important, with multiple generations maintaining close connections and mutual support. Traditional ceremonies continue to be conducted. Medicine men still learn the songs and prayers, the sand paintings and rituals that can restore harmony and heal illness. The blessing way, the enemy way, the night chant, and other ceremonies continue to be performed, maintaining connections to ancient knowledge and spiritual power. While the number of practitioners may have declined, those who remain active work to preserve and pass on this knowledge. At the same time, the Navajo Nation functions as a modern government. The Tribal Council meets regularly, passing legislation and managing a budget of hundreds of millions of dollars. The nation operates extensive programs in education, healthcare, social services, law enforcement, and economic development. It negotiates with the federal government, with states, with corporations, and with other tribes. It participates in regional and national political processes, advocating for policies that benefit the Navajo people. The relationship with the federal government remains complicated. The Navajo Nation is sovereign, but its sovereignty is limited and dependent on federal recognition and support. The federal government maintains trust responsibilities toward the Navajo, but has often failed to fulfill these responsibilities adequately. Disputes over water rights, over land management, over the provision of services promised in treaties continue to this day. Looking back over the centuries of Navajo history, certain themes emerge. Adaptation has been central to Navajo survival. The ability to learn from neighbors, to adopt new technologies and practices, to change while maintaining core values and identity. Resilience has been equally important, the ability to endure suffering, to survive catastrophe, to rebuild after devastation. The Long Walk and Bosque Redondo tested the Navajo people to the limit, but they survived, returned, and rebuilt. Another theme is the importance of place. The Navajo relationship with their land is not just economic or political, but spiritual and existential. This land is where the holy people taught the ancestors to live. These mountains are the pillars of the sky. These places are named in the songs and stories. To be Navajo is to belong to this place, to walk in beauty between the sacred mountains. The story of the Navajo is not finished. The people continue to face challenges, poverty, health problems, language loss, environmental degradation, the ongoing impacts of historical trauma. But they also continue to show the same resilience and adaptability that have characterized their history. They continue to maintain their identity as Diné, as the people, as children of the land between the sacred mountains. The ceremonies continue. The language, though endangered, is still spoken. Children are still born into clans, still connected to generations of ancestors. The sheep still graze on the desert plateaus. The weavers still create textiles of extraordinary beauty. The jewelry makers still work silver and turquoise into distinctive designs. The stories are still told. The songs are still sung. Tonight, as we conclude this journey through Navajo history, we can reflect on what this story teaches us. It is a story of survival against tremendous odds, of maintaining identity and culture in the face of powerful forces demanding assimilation. It is a story of adaptation and resilience, of learning from disaster and rebuilding from ruin. It is a story of a people connected to their land and to their traditions, finding ways to honor the past while building a future. The Navajo people have walked a long and difficult road, from their ancient migrations southward to their forcible removal to Bosque Redondo, and their triumphant return home, from near destruction to rebuilding and renewal, from subjugation to growing sovereignty. Their journey has been marked by suffering, but also by remarkable endurance. They have given the world beautiful art, brave warriors, the unbreakable code that helped win a world war, and an example of how a people can maintain their identity and dignity through centuries of change. As you rest tonight, you might think of those sacred mountains, Blanca Peak rising in the east where dawn appears, Mount Taylor standing in the south where the sun climbs high, the San Francisco Peaks marking the west where the sun sets, and the La Plata Mountains in the north. You might imagine the high desert landscape of the Navajo homeland, with its red rock canyons and wide skies, its harsh beauty and profound peace. You might think of the Navajo people, past and present, walking in beauty on that land, maintaining traditions handed down through generations, adapting to new challenges while honoring old wisdom. The story of the Navajo reminds us that culture and identity can endure even in the face of tremendous adversity, that a people connected to their land and their traditions can survive and even flourish despite overwhelming odds, that the human spirit has remarkable capacity for resilience and renewal. It is a story worth remembering, worth honoring, and worth learning from. And with that, we come to the end of our time together tonight. The story of the Navajo continues, written each day by the people themselves as they live their lives, raise their families, practice their traditions, and face their futures. May they walk in beauty. May they continue to endure. May their stories and songs echo through the canyons for generations to come. Rest well.